Hey everyone. So, something I want to talk about today is a dicey topic. I want to talk about why are people resistant to serverless and what does serverless invoke in people that get a conversation going that can sometimes get heated. And I think a good example of this is a while back, I gave a presentation at a DevOps meetup where I was introduced as the person that would be talking about serverless and hopefully not talking about how serverless will take away people's jobs, which was a fun way to be introduced to a room full of like 100 DevOps professionals. The way that I look at serverless is not as a job removal tool. It's looked at as a way to basically make us move faster and innovate faster. But I think the big thing is that change can be very uncomfortable, and so every iteration of processes and way that we've done things right has caused some friction, right? If you go back in time and you look at pre-cloud adoption, and you think about how people viewed cloud versus doing things on premises, there was a very strong resistance to it. People didn't like it. People thought, it's not going to catch on. It's just a trendy thing. It's going to go away. There's a lot of downsides to doing that, and over time, obviously, we saw how that played out. And I think that we're seeing the same thing right now with serverless. So the things that I've noticed, seeing how people actually transition from virtual machines to containers to cloud functions, there's a knowledge gap. And the knowledge gap is that when you work with a virtual machine and you had a server on premises, people understand how that works and they can really easily engage with that. They can run their application. It doesn't require a lot of different services that they didn't hear about or how these connections work together. They may not need that scalability that serverless can offer. And it can be just a whole bunch of added overhead that can be very off-putting at first. But I think that the big thing there is that if you don't have that traditional experience, so you're fresh out of a code school, if you're just learning about development, if you're just learning about cloud, if you're building full stack applications, and now you're getting into more of like a back end role, or you're worrying about deploying infrastructure, or how do I scale this application out in like the modern 2020 world? That's where this knowledge, going to the point where you understand how to build out virtual machines and install everything on there, run it, scale it, do all those things, the knowledge there is almost not required anymore to run that same type of application on cloud functions. And I think that that's where we really see this friction take place, because it's basically saying, hey, I don't need to know all this stuff anymore. And if I don't need to know it, why am I doing it? And why are we doing it? And are these skills still beneficial? The answer to that, in my opinion, is yes. So I worked in an operations team even after being a serverless consultant. And what I can tell you is having that knowledge, that deep knowledge about how the underlying infrastructure and servers work, puts you at a very far ahead of other people that are coming out of code school or out of a different field that are starting to learn about serverless, because you understand how the different components work. You understand how the operating system works, how the hypervisor works, how all the different how servers used to be packaged with AMIs and all these things. And so you use that knowledge and you can apply it to serverless, and it allows you to get a lot more creative. And then you can use all these tools to really benefit you in a way that potentially somebody else wouldn't be able to do because they don't have that same deep experience. I know personally right now, when it comes to serverless, there's a lot of infrastructure kind of gaps. So what that looks like is, for instance, if I'm going to build out some AWS serverless API or website, and I'm using all these different services, what I can easily run into is there won't be full end-to-end functionality that I can just spin up, right? So what that means is that I'll be able to use a framework like the serverless framework or CloudFormation or AWS SAM, Terraform, something like that. But at the end of the day, there's always some little piece that I want to take advantage of. It could be a new feature release or just a gap in the current functionality. And to do that, I have to write things like bash scripts, right? And so when it comes to working with servers and containers, people that work with that every day, they're very familiar with writing bash scripts and scripting and doing startup scripts and all these things. So that knowledge definitely transfers over to serverless, where it's somebody who doesn't have that, but maybe they have a JavaScript background or a HTML, CSS, React, Angular background, and now they're learning about cloud development and infrastructure. They then have to make that jump as well to not only understand how the hosting works, how the server works, how the containers that are running underneath it work, but now they also have to understand, and of course the backend runtime, Node.js or Golang or Java, but they also have to understand how the infrastructure deployment works and how you actually do this type of scripting. And so there's a lot of different layers there. And so although some of the job responsibility that we had before and the overhead associated with that, it's lessened. We still have to manage some parts of it. And so I think that that's where people can really transition into, serverless and into other things like this. So, moving past that, where is the resistance level with serverless, and why do people get that resistance level? I think the core thing is that, just change in general. And as people learn more about it, I think that change goes down, because the ideas around this is the end all solution. I use it one service and I'm able to run my entire application kind of goes away, and there's like extra complexity there. And I think a lot of times when people talk about pretty much anything on cloud or serverless or new technologies, a lot of times they only show like a hello world example. And the problem with that is that it doesn't go deep enough for you to actually understand all the intricacies that really take place when you're building a production system. However, with serverless currently, if you compare that to building an application with a virtual machine or with a container, there's going to be much less overhead. And that's because there's fully managed services for REST APIs and S3 hosting for websites, cloud functions, and all these things. And if you take advantage of those, you're going to be able to go a lot further than you could if you were building it from scratch. And so I think moving into 2020, towards the end of 2020 into 2021, 2022, I think that we're going to see the adoption rate increase a lot more. I think that people that already have a background in technical operations, that have a background in bash scripting, server management, working with containers, EC2 instances, virtual machines, I think that we're going to see a lot more people like that transition over to serverless, and then be able to build out systems that are much more scalable and robust, and then even pick up some development experience as well if they don't already have it. And I think that we're going to see a lot of people transition from those roles over to kind of a full stack cloud developer, or more like a back-end operations mix type thing, strictly because the infrastructure still takes quite a bit to build it. So for instance, I might want to build an API, but then how am I going to deploy it, right? So what we see a lot of people do is they'll build a backend API with serverless on AWS, and they'll use API Gateway, they'll use DynamoDB as a NoSQL database, they'll use Lambda functions. But then when it actually comes to deploying those things, they won't use, for instance, a framework. So they'll use the AWS CLI, or they'll use the console. The problem with those two options, the CLI is a little bit better, but it's still very brittle. But for the console, it's all manual, right? And so the same reason why we don't build, the same reason that we fall into traps with virtual machines is that it's very easy to go onto the AWS console, click the create a virtual machine, grab the PIM file, and then actually SSH into it, install everything that you need, and now you have a running server. That was very easy. When it comes to containers, a similar thing. It takes a little bit more. You have to build like a Docker image and all these things, and host that Docker image to actually connect it with Elastic Container Service on AWS. But you can still achieve that. But with AWS Lambda and with these other fully managed services, you still have to manage the deployment of the infrastructure. And so we don't want to do the manual route or redeploy it inside of the AWS console and we click a whole bunch of buttons, because if, for instance, we go back to the traditional model, if a developer that very much understands how our servers are set up, if they create all the servers themselves and they don't share that back with the team, what can end up happening is that if that person leaves at some point, it just becomes a black box that no one understands. And so we definitely want to avoid black box development. And how we do that is by just making sure that anything that happens, whether it's startup scripts or whether it's any type of understanding about how the servers fit together with the overall architecture, are well documented, even videos that are mapping out how it actually works. And then as we move into containers, same thing. We don't want somebody that builds the containers to have all that knowledge. But once we move to containers, we actually have things like Docker, and we have Docker images, and they actually have kind of like self-documenting infrastructure. But then when we move into serverless, it's kind of at the extreme, right? So because these are fully managed services, we can create entire templates that have all the functionality inside of it. They fit really well into this model, and we can then move from doing things manually in the console to doing things through CloudFormation, AWS SAM, or even the serverless framework. Personally, I use the serverless framework because it has all the functionality that I need to build these APIs and to build these backend databases. And so what we'll do is we'll basically create a serverless framework template that defines our API layer, our database layer, our authentication layer, the backend business logic and compute side. And then we stitch all these things together using bash scripts. We make deployments, we build CI/CD pipelines. And so the way that we handled this in a virtual machine area is we would still have that CI/CD pipeline. Containers, we still have the CI/CD pipeline. When it comes to the infrastructure creation, we still have startup scripts. With serverless, we have deployment scripts. They're probably both using Bash, most likely. People can use Python and all those things as well, but a lot of times just use a Bash scripts. It's pretty easy and straightforward. When it comes to the infrastructure as code, people started doing that with virtual machines using CloudFormation. They started doing that with containers using CloudFormation and other scripts that work into their CI/CD pipeline. And then now moving into serverless, it's even more so. So because the CloudFormation was very robust and able to do so many things on AWS, they created AWS SAM and serverless framework out of that, which allows people to be able to deploy these things in a little bit easier format. And so now it allows you to do like code updates as well. And you don't have to worry about the operating system and updating that or the security of the underlying operating system. And you can pretty much, you don't have to worry about downloading a PIM file and actually going onto the server, potentially leaking that PIM file out and somebody getting access to your server. With serverless, you just drop your code on there, you set the runtime, you use something like the serverless framework to create the API layer, authentication, database. You run a single CLI command like serverless deploy or AWS SAM deploy. And with that, everything's created. It's all self-documented. It's all probably worked into your CI/CD pipeline. And because there's all these automation and this developer experience that's been really focused on, now the CI/CD pipeline has become a lot easier to work with. So what I mean by that is it used to be a whole bunch of different commands, and you had to do a lot of this stuff manually, right? So if I just use CloudFormation and I try to achieve what the serverless framework does or AWS SAM does on my behalf, I would have to create a whole bunch of automation and a whole bunch of scripting. Or I could use something like the serverless framework or AWS SAM, and it kind of takes it to the next level. I can focus more on my application code itself and then go from there. And so that's kind of where I feel like a lot of friction happens here, just to kind of loop it back, is that personally, being a developer, I like writing application code. I like writing backend code. I like writing Node.js, Python, so on. And so then when I look at a platform like a Wix, or when I look at a platform, like Squarespace or other no-code platforms out there that are starting to tackle the backend as well, there is a certain level of friction that I feel, and almost like feeling a little bit uncomfortable, as well as like, what does my job look like, right? If there's these no-code platforms coming out that allow me to build a website or build a backend without having to have this this knowledge that I worked so hard for over so many years, and then there's a no-code platform that just comes out and actually does it, what ends up becoming the case every single time is that developers transition, right? So as one part of our job gets easier, we move to the next part. And so obviously that requires continuous learning. And that's why, specifically in the field of software development, it can be so challenging as, people continuously age, because the learning has to continuously grow as well. And if at any point you slow down in your career and in your learning path, then you start to see, gaps form. Because if, for instance, I stopped learning in 2006 how to do things, and now we're in 2020 and we're using Lambda functions and all these things that didn't exist back then, the competition is much stronger, right? So if I wasn't doing things on the cloud back in 2006 and now 2012 happens and people are on the cloud, my set of job skills has to transition. And if they don't, I can kind of get pushed out of the market a little bit. So I think it's really a great time to start learning about serverless, especially if you come from a background like operations, because there's a lot of things that transition over. And if you embrace it, then you can be on the front line of that transition. And if you don't embrace it, then you're kind of stuck playing catch up. And I purely believe that. I think other people have their opinions. Is serverless going to be the future? I definitely believe so. I believe that people are going to build applications with serverless as their number one choice. But we'll see what happens. And if that's not the side that you take, then just stay involved, right? Like make sure that you're following it every day, because things change actively. Probably not every day, maybe every month or every 6 months it changes. But the big thing is that being on the front line of something and building those out. And if you do transition from an operations background, understanding that your opinion really means something, right? Because a lot of people out there, specifically at that meetup, I took that as an example, there was hundreds of people there, and all of them work in a similar type of jobs using like Ansible and Chef and all these like server automation tools, as well as building infrastructure and virtual machines and working on cloud. And so having someone that's been doing that for 3, 5, plus years, write articles and make videos and really expose the whole community to this kind of transition and how you can transition, then I think that that's where a lot of people are going to actually jump on board and they'll be ahead of the curve. And so as new technology comes out and people want to take advantage of that efficiency, for instance, businesses, right? When businesses see, oh, for new accounts, they were able to save 99% of their cost. When businesses see that, when CEOs see that, CTOs see that, CFOs, et cetera, VPs of engineering, they start prioritizing the usage of serverless. Whether or not the company has the expertise in-house or not, they're going to prioritize it. And it's because the business value is more important to the business than the specific preference on the development tools. And so what that looks like in practice is that if you're not learning about the latest and greatest type of technologies and staying ahead of that, you can kind of get phased out a lot faster than somebody that is. And so that would be my advice. Stay tuned on all of it, follow it, understand that your experience really does transition. And somebody that's coming out of code school that is starting to get, working with serverless, they're not going to understand the full scope of what's actually happening. You might, if you're coming from an operations background. So definitely spend the time to understand it. If you have the ability to write content or make videos, do that as well. Share it back with the community. And I think that, I think ultimately everybody's going to be in a lot better place in the next few years as serverless continues to increase in adoption, as the cloud continues to progress and more use cases kind of fit underneath this. And it becomes that knowledge gap drops a little bit. Because right now, you have to understand every single component. And in the future, hopefully that's not the case, because then people are able to move a lot faster and do a lot more cool things and innovate. So anyways, this was Ryan Jones from Serverless Guru. If you like this content, make sure to hit the like button and subscribe. I do live streams sometimes when I'm thinking about topics. If you have a topic that you want to hear about, definitely drop it in the comments below. I'll get pinged about it so I can respond back immediately. If you want to catch me on Twitter, you can go to twitter.com/RyanJonesIRL, or you can go to the Serverless Guru X Twitter channel, and that's where you can find us as well. If you're looking for serverless consulting, if you're a company and you're trying to transition your team into serverless or trying to save cost or increase developer efficiency, productivity, all those things, then you can check us out on serverlessguru.com, and we'll get in touch with you. We'll schedule a call and we can see where it goes. So anyways, signing off and have a good rest of your Monday.